healthy. My niece is growing. It's so tall. Yes. Yes. I've got one, whatever the genes are. The main tallest. Oh, not quite 2 years old. Right.
Introduce her to this one.
All right. I guess we're ready to get started. Hi, everybody. We have a really kind of short looking agenda, but mostly I think what we're going to be doing is discussions today about funding scenarios. I think what we have to do first is approve the minutes from the last meeting and talk through any changes that anybody might have. If no changes, can I get a motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting?
Motion to approve.
Second. Perfect. Okay. We can go around and all say aye.
You don't have to. You can
No.
just do the consensus. Yeah.
Consensus is okay. We'll go forward with that. And then, does anybody have any questions about the scoring? I know we've all completed it now, and it was a lot. It was 71 this time, so it was even more than last year. And I know that we were sent the data and kind of how everything looks, how the scoring went. And so, does anybody have any questions to start out about the scoring system or the data that county staff sent to us? No? Okay.
So we're going to run through what that data looks like. We have Matt Baker here with us, resident expert. And then we will open it up once we kind of look at this to conversation and discussion around what you all would like to see as funding scenarios moving forward.
All right, so here. So you guys have seen the data, and what we thought we'd do, no, this is your process. We want you guys, and you have the right at any point to say, zoom ahead, cut to the chase. You reserve that right. But what we thought we would do is start with talking about the rule sets themselves. So what you have here in this first one is last year's rule set with soft cap at 100,000, an encouraged cap of 100,000, if you will, and then reduced funding depending on what the score came out to be, going from to 80, 60, and 50% of the ask of the requested amount. What we presented here as well are two alternative scenarios, and again, we're talking about starting points. This is going to be the point of reference to begin discussions and dealing out funds. Alternative scenario one would be no cap on requests, and essentially you would be funding as many as 100% of, as you could. And then alternative scenario two would be a cap of $80,000, soft cap $80,000, with reduced funding after you go beneath that 90% score threshold to 80%, but no lower than 80%. So these are just three scenarios we would like you folks to consider.
The first thing that I think that needs to be decided is if you are, it's like last year, you guys decided you were going to cap them all at 100% and then apply. So did you ask for applications at 80%? That's why we factored that in, but I mean, you don't have to use that cap, but that is probably one of the first decisions is, are you wanting to fund any of them over the 80,000? Because there was 5 applications that came in at above that 80,000 level.
Essentially, how soft is that cap?
Matt, it might be helpful if we could see what the mean and median requested amounts would be.
All right, I can handle that. So I was going to give you some overall statistics anyway, so I can just zoom ahead to this a little bit. So if you look at it by focus area, this is kind of how it breaks out with this first graph here on the left. What you'll see is a number, and this is too small. I can fill in more, a little bit more. You'll see initially the number of applications for that focus area, the focus area itself, and then the amount of money that that represents. So this is how it kind of breaks down if you look at it by focus area. If you wanted to look at it, you'll see that most of it falls under, over 50% falls under resident well-being, which is a 1.75 million. If you look at it by category, when we talk about category, we mean adult education, air quality, food, health, those things like that. It's much smaller bites. And you can look at these if you wanted to. If you have a question later on, we can circle back to this. K-12 education, that's 514,000 for that specific category. Requested, because again, this is requested amounts. Energy conservation would be 69,000, for instance. So we can circle back to this if you want to, but your question, Chuck, was around the mean. I don't have that readily available, but what I can do is calculate it for you right quick. You want the mean or the median or both?
I think it would be helpful to see both.
And just as a reminder, we did in the application say that it was encouraged to request 80,000 or below. So as Matt was saying, it was very soft cap that the committee was asking for. But I just wanted to remind everyone of that language.
So this is not the ideal placement for this, but I'm just going to put it here for now. This green one, that's your median, 35,000. And this is your average, say orange, it's around 46,000. So what other information can we provide before we start discussing which kind of rule set you guys want to lean into?
Sarah, with the proviso of requesting no higher than 80,000, we have 5 that ignored that. How many did we have last year?
They ignored that?
Well,
There
we
wasn't a
didn't
cap last year.
How many were above 80,000 last year? How many were 100,000 higher?
It'll take me a few minutes, but I can find that.
I'm just curious if that proviso had any effect. You know, not for those who requested 150 or 100, 125. And sometimes as a grantee, you try to go with the largest that you can possibly ask for, knowing that you're going to get less.
Sandbag.
And these experienced grantees who come back for the last 3 years know that they're going to get less than they asked for by a percentage. So they're working the system thinking that larger the request based on the same percentage of the approved amount will be higher. So the mean and the median, I think, is important because if you look at, I'm surprised the median is so low compared to the mean, that those who are requesting smaller grants, if we apply the same percentage to them at the top 90 to 100%, they'll be getting, the numbers of them will be getting proportionately less than they got last year. I'm not speaking factually, but that's my thought process. And those who ask for more will be getting proportionately more if they're still in that 90 to 100% category. So I don't know what we do with that information. I'm just observing that if your intuition as a grantee, as an experienced grantee, based on your skill level, you might just go ahead and ask for a high amount. And then we fall behind and say, okay, you get that same percentage across the board. So it takes a little science out of it, more individual judgment.
And we have 2 over 80,000 with the highest score, so it really affected those 2.
And Chuck, just
Right.
to answer your question, there were 6 applications last year over 80,000.
There were 5 this year. So don't pay attention. So I'm thinking, Amy, what we can do is that look at those who are over 46, their requested amount, which is the mean, and apply a little bit more thought to how much they should be getting versus what percentages calculate. Because I think in the past 3 years, we automatically use the calculation based on the percentage of overall score, multiply one to the other, and we didn't fine tune very much. We just kind of, everybody accepted that that's the way it should go. I'm just speaking for me.
So here's some high level statistics. That's your range there, the max and the min. So there's some variability, which explains that low median. Anyone want to break the ice where you think you might want to start?
We did also last year, correct me if I'm wrong, there was an idea about funding grants at a certain level and below at 100%, but I don't know that that's something we want to do. I'm just bringing it up because we talked about it last year. And I believe it was 10,000 and below. So if they scored relatively high, we didn't do 80%, or the thought was maybe we don't do 80% or 60%, but we do the full amount because it was a low ask. I want to say it might have been Kevin that suggested that last year, and he's not on the committee anymore, but it's worth at least talking over and seeing what everyone's perspective is.
And also last year, 80% was the highest award y'all did last year at all. And so I would think that a conversation would be, you want to consider funding some of them at 100%, just because otherwise you're going to go through and give everybody partial funding, which means they all have to revamp their projects. Basically.
Right.
Did you think about traditional?
We may want to look at starting, as you suggested, with that soft cap. How soft is it? If we figure that piece out, then that gives us some direction into a couple other points raised.
Well, with the cap and the number of applications that got a score over 90%, everybody else got the total amount. The others are all less than the median. Am I looking at that right? Yeah, everything above 90%, actually numbers.
See, your hand up, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. I want to speak to what Chuck raised. And so I think, of course, we have to look at our process right now going forward for this year. But I think going forward, Chuck's concerned about how organizations, smart organizations, might game the system, might impact how we weigh budget and how it's weighed in our process for, say, next year, that we might adjust that, or we might incentivize lower budgets and somehow in our scoring system reward lower budgets. So we incentivize that inclination. I'm not saying we do that now. It doesn't make sense now. You know, the organizations did what they did with the rules we gave them. But I share Chuck's concern that smart organizations might look at the way we approach it and game that. So I think we need to take that into account in some strategic way for next year and for future years. Thank you.
That's definitely a good point for when we start talking about what our process looks like. Yeah. We're gonna have those conversations coming up sooner than we think about any changes we need to make to the process. So that's real good to keep in mind.
And so also just to reemphasize what Matt said earlier, you know, if we choose a scenario where you're saying we're going to do a cap at 85, and we want to see what it does look like to start funding them. It's a starting point where you can tweak them, or if there's one that you feel strongly about that should or shouldn't be considered for funding, that you can still discuss those on an individual basis. But I think just to get the conversation going, you can kind of decide, you know, do you want to do a cap? Do you want to consider funding some of them at 100%, or are you set on doing it at more than 80% like last year? Just got to get some of the ground rules in so that then we can start looking at some different scenarios and see if there's one that we might can start with.
And also keep in the back of your minds that it's 71 requests amounting to $3.2 million, and you have a little under $1 million to dole out.
Right.
You're not going to be able, at any level, to fill all of these in a meaningful way.
I know that was the thinking behind the soft cap. If we could just sort of use the money across more projects, that would be lovely. So what are everybody's thoughts on the soft cap, and are we now going to make that?
Support that.
You do, okay.
Did you get any feedback last year of ones who maybe had canceled a project because they didn't get funding?
Last year we did not have any cancel. We did have to go back with them and they had to tweak their outcomes and everything. The year before, we did have one project that couldn't get off the ground. Because they couldn't do it. Yeah.
And it was related to having a lower amount of funding.
They declined the funding.
Yeah.
They declined the grant altogether.
And do we create an alternate that would get that?
Yeah, it reverts back to the general fund.
Okay.
And I believe it was a pretty small.
It was a $10,000 ask.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good consideration, but I hadn't thought that if they don't get full funding, it's not gonna, enable them to move forward or not. My inclination is to put a cap on it to disperse more funds to more projects. I think there's a lot to talk about points that Ray and Chuck brought up for next year. This being my first year, my struggle was the difficulty of evaluating the need. I didn't see that necessarily expressed in the application or the scoring system to a level that I felt like I could really dial in, looking for a return on investment. I would like to suggest that we move forward with a cap so that we can disperse more funds, with the exception that if it's not enough money to support the project, maybe we can reconsider on an individual basis.
Well, and would it make sense if it's below a certain amount that, we also have a minimum? We're not gonna give somebody 50% of a $10,000. You know what I'm saying? Because you can't really, there's not, you know what I mean? It's just,
It's
yeah.
cutting them at the knee.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that, yeah.
One scenario we don't have on here, but might be useful as a starting point, I'm just going to throw another one out there, is put the cap in place and then start with 100% funding and then work your way out from there.
Can we see what that would look like relatively quickly? And
Absolutely.
then maybe that might help us with some of our conversations.
Cap rate.
Right, 80,000 is the cap rate.
Oh, some math to get into back in the day.
You can just go to the 125 and then just for that one, instead of having it go to the G cell,
The B cell.
I mean, just do a 80,000 times the percent category.
That was the only one over at that point.
Yes.
So that leaves us with it's 55,000. You get one more out of it, and still over by about $5,000.
But look at the scores, because I think you have two applications there with the exact same
Same,
score.
yeah.
That one and the one below it have the exact same score.
It's not the same amount too. This one has one more person recommending it.
Which one is it?
This one right here, the United Lead Homes.
There was only one application that wasn't scored by everyone, and it wasn't that one. That's why I was making sure because,
So it actually would be. Near about 5,000 over 4,000. But that's with a cap of $80,000 and everybody funded at 100%.
Can you scroll down to the total?
Yes, and that gets you 21 out of 7,
yeah, I think it's counting, yeah, 21 projects.
totals 904, 992.
Can you make the screen a little bit larger? Some of us are old.
I think something else to consider is I know that there is a desire to spread the wealth as much as possible, to get as many projects funded as possible. But also really thinking about the impact of the projects that you are funding. You know, funding a project at 100%, what's the impact from that versus funding them at 80 or 60% of what they've requested? Another consideration.
Let's get you 30% of the projects.
Sorry, what does that look like across the 4 objectives?
Oh, in terms of how that shakes out amongst the focus areas?
Yes.
Can do that.
So that was 30% of the projects with an 80,000 cap.
100% funding it up to 8,000.
Oh, right.
And I guess I would ask if anybody said they didn't want to fund any of those projects, that would be if there was a specific reason why, because we would consider funding 100%, and so they felt like there was an issue with that.
Then there's a discussion.
Yeah.
Angela, how many did we actually fund last year?
I think it was 32.
There's 2.
And how many is in this group? We just talked about.
Maybe.
Looks like that. Make that bigger. So about 34% is going to educated and capable, 24 to vibrant economy, 38 to resident well-being, and 4% to environmental stewardship, which tracks a little more favorably to educated and capable and vibrant economy, and takes a little bit out of resident well-being as a proportion of all the overall requests. And environmental tracks very much close to it with what the request. That's where it was up 6% overall.
Is it 6% or 6 requests?
6 requests.
6 requests, I'm sorry. Was like $284,000.
So you're saying that chart tracks closely with the number of applicants per category?
Roughly, it's a little more favorable to education and vibrant economy. Takes a little bit away from resident well-being to accommodate that.
Of the top 21, I see one organization represented twice. Just wondering that.
which organization is illegal. And that, that's I think a conundrum each year
Yeah.
because they provide such really necessary
I know,
services
I
to
know.
underserved
Yeah.
populations in the
Yeah.
county, but, and like, we don't know where to fit them, right?
Yeah.
How do you get them the money that they need and,
I struggled with that when I got to that. And
Yeah.
the conclusion I came to was, if they're outlining very specific projects, and they're gonna be required to demonstrate, how that funding was utilized for each project.
And that's the case.
That
with-
may need to be open. Okay.
And that's the case for them, because they receive funding through other county sources as well.
Mhm.
But they do have very clearly defined projects that they're funding, it's not like they're not double dipping for their operating expenses.
you know, and my recollection from the site visits is that they track the residents, so like, they're only spending money on Buncombe County, they're not, you know, utilizing the funds across all their counties.
So their total, to Amy's point, is about 110,000 between the two projects. I think they were the largest grantee last year, if I'm not mistaken. I had asked that we look at last year's final funding. I forgot who I asked that of.
So their request is actually 160.
Yeah, it was
160 this year.
160.
Yes, sir.
Two $80,000 requests.
That was my addition.
Have we looked at the 80% of funding for the top scores yet?
Like look
We've
at the
seen that.
scenario with 80%,
Yeah, just to
so
see
do
what,
partial funding for everybody
Yeah.
again. Scenario.
I know last year, I think we gave the ones above 90% a higher percentage.
We gave them 80%,
We gave them 80%, and then some of the other ones, we
we're
gave,
60.
we're 60, okay. I mean, have we
Yeah.
looked at that
It's-
scenario?
That's right here,
Yeah.
scenario 3,
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I can't
80,
see.
80, 80,
Like Chuck, I can't see.
and then 65.
Is that with the soft cap built in?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Does that increase our number of,
Oh, sure.
It does, but it does result in a partial funding to everyone, so we would have to go back to them and see. It's not gonna be the same results as the applications that you read, because.
right, yeah. But do you have to go to each one individually and ask them if they can do the project?
Yeah, so if they're asking for
absolutely.
30,000, we're giving 15, can you do the project?
That's a pain.
Well, and this is where like somebody getting $6,000 when they really requested 12. It's like, it's not gonna, you know.
How many more did it increase?
Uh,
Not a lot, or no, maybe.
It does add it pretty significantly. I think it adds around 12, 14 more.
But that's with the lowest getting 50%, so that's a
It is.
specific
Right.
scenario.
Well-
So there's probably intermediate scenarios where you give the top 90% and below a certain number, you give 75. So there's a lot of ways you can play it.
Right.
But 50% does, I mean, 50% rings to me like those people are gonna have to do major.
Yeah, that's hard,
And so that might not be the best solution.
right?
It's not just that the lowest get 50%, it's that nobody gets 100% as well.
Right. But I mean, when you look at the number they're getting, you know, 50% really is a major retooling
Right,
of what
sure.
we're doing.
Right, so that scenario 3 is the scenario that you all used last year,
Yeah,
applied to this year's application.
And there was a really strong sentiment on the committee last year to try to spread the money around to as many organizations as possible. But that's why we ended up there.
Ray put something into the chat. Ray, do you want me to read that to the group, or did you want to kind of summarize?
Hi, thank you for asking. This is Ray. What I really put into the chat was for staff for future considerations, because I think it impacts this conversation, especially when we're saying, well, what does different level of fundings do? That when we're reviewing applications, rather than saying, would you want to fund this fully or partially, which is, I think, roughly how the question is worded, that we actually break that out. Do you want to fund fully? Do you want to fund partially? Do you not want to fund this project? So that when we're doing this, if we have the majority of the committee wanting to fund fully a project, then we might actually use that information at this meeting to prioritize those more highly, regardless of budget, than those who we all, then let's say a majority say want to fund partially. That gives us information, a shortcut to information for prioritizing different organizations. And then I guess I just wanted to say with that scenario 3-2, which I did not put this in chat, where I guess that's 80% of 80. Is that how we get this to the 64,000 that's bolded? Is that right?
That's correct. This one has a
Because
capital A.
just noting that one was our third highest score, and we include budget in our judging criteria. Now, I agree with what I think Chuck was saying, or at least my outcome of what Chuck was saying, that we might actually factor in budget as a larger factor in the future, so therefore incentivize people to make proposals that are smaller. But just noting that the third highest score for this committee, I'm not sure that we should soft cap and then go another 80%. That almost, to me, takes it down to 80,000. But I really apologize for not being there in person. I had a meeting go long and I just couldn't make it. It's harder to do this remotely. I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
You're fine, Ray. But to your point, yes, for that specific instance, that actually is effectively a cut of about 50%.
Which is how you all did the scenario last year when you implemented that 100,000 and you still applied that. So that's why that scenario is that way. But if you don't like it, then you could just leave that one at the 80,000 and take off a couple of funds off of the bottom.
That's what we thought, actually.
But if they're doing
Oh,
the
just leave
80,000
it at 80, just cut it once.
To Ray's point, Angela may remember this. I think the first year we did this, we not only scored them, but we actually, each committee member gave, their desired funding for each project. And then you kind of totaled it all together. You probably don't, it looks like you don't remember. It was, I think it was just the first year, and then you guys felt, I think you just decided it was too complicated. But I think that is kind of, it is, it's hard to do it any other way than to have people say, okay, I would allocate X amount, once you get down to individual projects. I'm not advocating that we do it that way, but what Ray said rang a bell with me, that we did once do it that way. Do you remember that?
I do, but I mean, it's kind of a pain, I think.
Yeah.
And then, I know, as part of committee work, there's 9 different opinions on things and everything. But one thing that we do want to make sure that we're keeping at the heart of all of it is making sure that we have a transparent, equitable process. So, I mean, if we're doing individual award amounts and all, we have to make sure that we're checking our own biases that we may have towards certain projects and anything. And that goes with any of the process that we're doing with these. That's kind of why we wanted to do the rules first before we displayed the list of who would be included, because we don't know who is and not included to impact, which scenario we're going to pick as our starting point.
Historically, have you ever funded 100%?
Yes. Last year was the first year we didn't do any.
Okay, so I didn't know if that was like the buffer of, we know they're going to over ask. Okay.
Last year, I know what we did, and sort of it made sense to us, but I am concerned that we're creating the problem that people have to ask more because they're not expecting to get 100%. That's my concern with doing it across the board. I know it makes sense, like from a math standpoint, but we might be having unintended consequences to the application process, and that makes it harder to spread the money out too.
And I also think that if we are gonna, and I'm not opposed to doing this, if we are gonna set an $80,000 cap post backhoe, we should just say it going in. I mean, because we're basically saying, well, we're letting you go over 80, but really we really mean our limit is 80, and it kind of creates, I think, it's like some kind of weird imbalance. So I think that if we're gonna do it this year, we should just make a hard cap.
I agree.
I was having the same thoughts that you're having, setting up the position.
Yeah.
And thinking about giving somebody 50% amount of lower ask, let's say $12,000. And that 50% of that is a significant retooling, very individualistic. To So to your point, 80% perhaps, that's more management, or just having a hard cap and not a soft cap going forward.
I mean, I think it makes sense. We don't have a huge budget, so, and a lot of applicants. Yeah, so many applicants.
I would rather
There's such
fund
a-
less than give a bunch of people 50%.
And working from the end, thinking how many completed projects, the 100% would be for completed projects, or the partially completed that struggled, and that kind of thing. So that's like where the 100s are great. I like the middle column personally, because there's almost a guarantee of the 10 or whatever 100% projects. The 80% will have to come up with other funding, and like to me, that's the person who's the applicant. Like, we planned on this, and so not only trying to implement their project, but also trying to find more funds. So I lean middle.
That middle does value through more projects.
And the middle has the cap in it, right?
And again, adopting a scenario is just adopting a starting point. You still.
That's right.
You still can consider them, and if there, like I said, if there's some that you feel strongly that you don't want to fund at 100%, or there's some that are down lower that you do want to fund, you still can consider those on an individual basis. It's just getting a starting point so that it does help with the process of going along and getting the decisions made.
Ray has a question.
Yes, Ray?
Hi, thank you. So just to say what, I think that was Angelin's voice. Sorry, I'm going by voice because it's hard for me to see.
It was me.
Hey, yay. I think it's problematic when we get to that kind of discussion of individual ones. I mean, we do our grading, and then when we're discussing individual ones, we have these, we bring our own, what I think you described as biases into it. And so a louder voice might then skew it one way or the other in favor or against, while we have these scores that we can just kind of go by. So I much prefer that. The other thing I wanted to really say more broadly, and it's going fundamentally, is to what strategic partnership grants are. The county has multiple grant programs that you all, staff certainly know better than I do. And so that includes some smaller grant things, like I'm on the Tipping Point Grant Review Committee. And so strategic partnership grant, and I just reread the language myself to see if it gave some hints here, like what are these meant to be? Because if we're trying to spread it out as much as possible, then in our process, we really could incentivize, like bias it toward, the kind of lower, anything under 30,000 qualifies for 100% rating. Anything under between 30 and 50,000 qualifies for a maximum 95% ranking. We could actually adjust the system so that to incentivize smaller, more concentrated, more thoughtful and strategic proposals because they actually get a scoring boost. But if the idea is we're partnering with nonprofits for like big projects, then to punish those who come up with big projects, it kind of so we need to really be clear, I think, as a committee, what strategic partnership grants are meant for from the county, from the commissioners, and then with that information for ourselves. And I think that affects right where we are right now, but also at the beginning, how people apply and how we're framing those applications. Thank you.
So Ray, if I can distill what you said and make sure I'm doing it correctly, are you suggesting that it's actually not it's more of a philosophical conversation to have first? Do we do low amounts broadly or larger amounts more narrowly? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that's true. And I'm thinking a little bit for the conversation here, that can inform it. But I'm even more thinking that to be fair to applicants who take the time to do this work, that we really need to be clearer in our language. If we're incentivizing and trying to, in this conversation, say, spread out the money, and it's not that I'm disagreeing with that value, then we should bake it into the process and really not just give soft cap language, which I agree with Liz should be hard cap and others should be hard cap, but also write that. We want the proposal to be concentrated and in a way, and they're rewarded for doing that. And then, but if we really want to have larger impact, and there are other programs that might do that, and other revenue grant places that people might go, county or not, for that, but we really want to have impact in major projects, which often will tie to major organizations that have larger money. So that is a philosophical choice. And I'm not saying we need to decide that. I actually think clarity from the county, and by that I probably mean the commissioners, but also like the staff in the room, like that would be helpful guidance. And then it would be helpful guidance for potential applicants. Thank you.
I agree that guidance would be helpful. I'm not sure if the commissioners are comfortable with that. I don't know the temperature.
I mean, I don't know that that's something that we're going to be able to get for this cycle.
Right,
just because
no.
we only have a couple of weeks.
That might be something that's.
But yes, for going forward, I mean, it's definitely a conversation that we can have. And then also to the point, if the ultimate goal of the committee is to spread the money to as many organizations as possible, then you might even want to consider a lower cap than that 80,000, because the higher your cap, then the fewer organizations you're going to be able to find. So, I mean, that again is something maybe not to have a conversation about today, but as you're doing process review and preparing for the next cycles, that may be something that you want to consider is, you know, do you want to keep that $80,000 or do you want it lower so that you can fund more organizations?
So is the 80,000 the cap for this right now, or is it because last year we talked about putting a cap on it? And
so $80,000 was put into the grant guidelines as the suggested max.
Okay.
Everything you see
I thought
here,
we did, that's why I was making.
everything you see here is capped at 80, but this one request right here, row 12, is actually a $125,000 request.
Apropos of Ray's comment, what is the definition of strategic partnership grants? I want to make things more complicated. If we have an appetite, the 4 focus groups, educated and capable, environmental stewardship, resident well-being, and vibrant economy, are the 4 strategic areas that the commissioners decided that the county should administer grants by. We have never done 25% for each. In, I think it was the second scenario, Matt, we came closer, but there was still divergence. Yeah.
This is scenario 1.
So have the commissioners, and maybe Rachel's the one to respond to my question, have they ever come back and say, why are you only putting 4% in the orange area, and so much larger in the blue and gray?
Yeah, so every year, you have representatives from the committee that goes before the commissioners once a year to kind of give an update on this. And that is a question that I think has come up multiple times. And the answer to that is, I mean, if we're only getting 6 applications for $200,000 from one of the strategic areas, you're not going to be able to put 25% of it in there because you can't fund applications that you're not getting. And we have increased outreach, trying to encourage applications from, you know, all of them. But from a commissioner or a county perspective, we don't expect it to be 25%. We just expect that all of the applications would go towards one of the strategic goals that the county has set.
So this, if we look at funding scenario 2, how many in the category that has the least applications, so the least representation, how many of those projects are being funded?
Say your question one more.
Sorry. In the scenario 2, can we look at, we have 6 applications for environmental stewardship. How many of those actually cut the mustard for scenario 2?
For environmental?
Yes.
There's not contract.
2. Yeah, I think it's just 2.
So I think the problem is twofold on that. First is we don't get that many applications, even though I understand there is outreach and people. So, and those, we did get 6 this year.
And that's the same for scenario 1, by the way.
Thank you. But I think it's also, I mean, I find it difficult to the need for the project. Like there is such a need versus what we're able to fund. And so it's hard to manage, you know, do you get people food, clothing, and shelter, or do you help save the environment from what we're doing to it right now with the building? That's very hard to manage. That's hard for me to manage. And I spend a lot of my time in rural communities and seeing what's happening. And so we bring our perspective to the scoring model. So I know when I see one that fits into environmental stewardship, I want it to have a chance. But if you're looking at immediate need versus health of the county need long-term, you know, you can kind of prioritize people over air quality or water quality. So I think in that category, the problem is twofold, is that, you know, one, way less requests. Two, it maybe gets scored a little less because you're going through 71 and the majority of them have to do with people's immediate needs. You know, where are they going to sleep tonight? How are they going to eat?
So when you brought up immediate needs, I wanted to bring up the categories that these fall into, just so that you can see it from that angle as well. So this is what that looks like. Basic needs is actually around 20% of what you're funding in scenario one. Education prominently there was 30% almost. Safety is there with 8%, and then adult education is a smaller cut of it. That's kind of roughly how this all shakes out. These are the amounts. Again, scenario one, $80,000 gap, fully funded.
I mean, I thought we had some really good applicants in environment. I actually started with that area because the funding was so low and because it was a category of itself. And I think you have to, it's like you have to be disciplined to think about upstream stuff, you know, because otherwise there's so many applicants in well-being. But also sometimes the well-being have more opportunity for other grants. You know what I'm saying? So that has to be taken into consideration too, that there's a lot of other people who give to those urgent needs and not a lot of other people who may be giving to environmental issues. And this may be one of the fewer opportunities for them to get funding. And it has a downstream individual impact that we have to be thoughtful about. So I do think there may be some value in thinking about how we weigh percentages based on these categories to try to increase funding to the environment category, because it's, I think 4% is too low.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Because we get so few requests. And it's something that the county commissioners ask us about. I've been at the presentation when they say, how come you didn't do more with the environment? We did what we could, you know, but it's worth looking at the numbers.
And it occurred to me that some of these projects are even going to be harder to do if you don't have enough money, because the types of things you're doing. You can't just like reduce the number of people you're serving. You're doing a project that, you know, requires resources, you know.
I completely agree with what you were saying, and I was attempting to try to evaluate that, looking at some of the different organizations' budgets. And, you know, a lot of what we're talking about is next year and future. But, you know, trying to determine what other resources they have available financially. Because some programs do have much limited options over others. But one piece of data that might be interesting that the county has, and I don't know, but so look at a pie chart of all the registered 501c3s that are in the county and compare that to the amount of applicants, so that we can determine where is the need for outreach, you know, based on the collective groups and nonprofits. You know, what do those statistics look like?
I can say with a lot of certainty we don't have it at our fingertips for this meeting.
Right. Everything we're talking about is future.
And I can tell you, just because I do work across multiple grant programs and all, I can tell you that 71 organizations is not I would venture to say probably not even 10% of all the nonprofits.
Right,
now.
yeah, like 10 times.
So I did want to take a moment to, since we're talking about environmental stewardship as a focus area, to point out with in these three scenarios, you would have to go to the third scenario. Second scenario actually waters it down because you still have only 2 environmental applications that made it to that level. So you're actually going to be funding less than 4%. And the third one, you have to go all the way down to the bottom of the 50s here before you get to a third one for environmental. So it's not going to increase environmental as a focus area based off the scoring that's been done, without significantly reducing funding across the board.
Yes, Ray.
I think, reiterate what folks have said. If we were getting 25% of our applications being environment and we were funding 4%, then we'd really have to take a deep look at how we're scoring things. But because we get so few applications, or I should rather say, between the 4 areas, the applications bias in certain ways. I think some of us, the ones that are rarer, we give extra kind of attention and love to. And so overall, I think in scoring, there may be even a bias for that, as opposed to some of the larger things where you see application after application that are very similar. So I don't know how we would account for that other than, I think staff does great outreach, other than increasing outreach or recognizing the need actually isn't even between the categories. And that's okay then if that's represented in our determinations.
So to your point, Ray, the way that breaks down is if you look at request.focus area, is 15% for vibrant economy, 22 for education, 9 for environmental, and 54 for resident public.
That was helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
See it as like an immediate return of the taxpayer. This kind of this is immediate, the gray would be, this is my tax dollar I've given, now this is how I can provide to my community. So that's kind of different levels I see.
And also to that point, so if, I know that environmental is a very low percent, but it's also a very low percent of the applications too, where if you're funding 2 of the 6, you're funding a third of the application. So I would bet if we looked at the percentages of the other ones, it's probably in line with percents, because, we do that for that commissioner meeting every year, and they're all, right about, between the 35 to 40%.
And they're funding 33 for environmental in either scenario, 1 or 2.
Say that again, please, Matt.
You'll be funding 33% of requests for this year in either scenario, 1 or 2.
Right, but look at the dollar amounts. I mean, the first one is 11,156.
They're lower dollar amounts.
30,000. I mean, you're up to 41,000 just in the top 20 or so.
Yes, it's 41,156 for environmental in scenario 1 and 2. 2 might be a little bit lower because it's 8%.
Hey, this is Ray. I'm just going to speak up this one time. I just want to say it would be interesting to do an analysis, not now and not for this part, but for the next part, about how the different categories score in our different criteria. That is, some of our criteria may bias more against, say, environmental stewardship overall in terms of the applications, and then whether the criteria we've established is fair between the different categories. Fair is not exactly what I'm looking for. If it supports some categories more than others, let's say equity supports more categories more than others, that doesn't necessarily mean we change that, but to be aware of that.
So this is a little bit off topic, but it goes to your point, Ray. The resident well-being focus area for our county strategic plan is broad. It's very broad. And in our next iteration, it'll probably be more focused, but right now it covers a lot of territory. Educated and capable does as well. So more things will fit into those 2 buckets than any of the other 2. It wasn't by design, it's just how it happened.
Ray, just to make sure that I'm understanding what you're asking, is you want to see, like, for the 6 scoring categories, how it goes across the different focus areas too, to make sure that, like you said, like, equity isn't a really high scoring in all of the resident well-being and automatically low in the environmental.
That's kind of what I mean, that we actually just find out what the average score is for each category between the 4 areas. Again, not for this process, but for looking at whether the process makes sense, both the questions and the way we score them across those 4 areas. And what I meant was, for example, environmental might have more rural applications, more rurally focused applications. There certainly can be applications with that support marginalized communities, if we're talking about equity specifically, because that's the example I gave. But there also can be ones that don't have that. It can go either way. And so some of our scoring might bias against between the different areas. And so knowing that it's kind of built in doesn't mean we get rid of those criteria, but it means we understand what the process biases are, and then we or county kind of decides whether that makes sense. And it might make sense. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. There are different values we bring to it. But it'd be good to know, and that's interesting, just like that. Yes, but then for each category as well.
Right. That's what I was gonna say. So we can easily show you this now, but to show it for each of the 6 scoring categories, we would have to pull the data, which is something we can do for the next meeting.
Right. This is just by the focus area. This is the average score by focus area, and it's fairly balanced.
Score, what is that, the score of?
That overall score.
Their overall score.
For the focus area.
I'm interested in, Ray, you're making really good points, and I was thinking some of the areas that this scoring would be worth taking a look at is maybe need for the project and equity, like Ray said, like what does that look like? Because if
you create a nut graph instead of average of overall score and have equity score, just for that category.
Right, we don't have.
Yeah, don't have it in this particular file.
But for the next, for the next meeting, we
But
would
it's-
definitely have that.
Yeah, that would be good information to have. Okay. So we've talked about making the soft cap a hard cap later. We've talked about maybe using that to guide us this time as well. Is everybody, is that one thing that we have some agreement on, or do we need more conversation around the $80,000 right now cap? Is utilizing that for our scoring models, so that's what we're looking at. Is that what we're going to use as a guideline to get us through these discussions
So there are
generally?
5 programs that are over 80,000.
Totally, but I think only one of them
Only one of them
scored high enough.
are in the, are at the top of the score.
So it would be that one that, in particular, we'd be talking about reducing from 125 to 80, and then looking at funding scenarios. Is there anybody that thinks that that's not appropriate? We need to talk about it more.
Hey, this is Ray. Just to reiterate what I said earlier, because I'm having trouble hearing about half of what's said in the room. I apologize for that. I think the one we're talking about was the 3rd highest score. If we're cutting it to 80 because we had suggested that as a soft cap, which I completely agree with the room that it should have been a hard cap, I'm okay with that. If we're then cutting it again, then I think we really need to take a better look at what that was, because it was our 3rd highest score. So I think cutting it to 80, like, that's where it should be, just personally. Thank you.
And so is there one of those 3 scenarios that you all would want to use as your starting point of the discussion?
Can I ask just one more on the second scenario? Can we look at 75 versus 80 and see if
We should
any
can
more?
easily.
Do we need to put, yeah, Yeah, just got 5,000 left. It grants you another 2 projects.
Only 2. I was trying.
And they're in educated and capable and resident well-being, one's K-12 education, one's mental health.
And then, I mean, just one of the questions to ask yourself as you're looking at it, and you're only giving them 3/4 of the amount that they
Yeah.
requested, and so how will that impact the project? Not saying that you can't do partial fundings or anything, but just know that what you scored as the project may not be what the project ends up looking like if you do low percentages.
So this is a 25% cut for 14 of the projects.
And as someone mentioned a while ago, if it's a, the number of people served, they could easily say, well, instead of 100, we can serve 75. But if it's something like, installing a refrigerator at their food pantry or something, they can't buy 3/4 of a refrigerator.
And it nets you a gain of 5
projects?
over the first scenario. But you reduce.
But Angela,
14.
Yeah, but you only got 2 from additional.
Yes, right.
But Angela, just to say, it's not that money isn't then useful. Like now you funded 75% of the refrigerator. So now the organization needs to find 25% of the refrigerator. So it's not to say it doesn't contribute something.
Right. And it's the nature of nonprofits to have to find funding. But then what if they don't find that extra funding for that refrigerator, then they can't buy the refrigerator at all?
Can we review the 3 scenarios again with the criteria we're using? Just, I want to understand better the difference between 1 and 2.
1 and 2 as they were, or the 75%?
As it were.
The difference between these 2 are, they both have the 80,000 cap. They, this one funds everything at, no, sorry.
Oh, I see. The difference is the 100% versus.
Yes.
Right, 100% versus
That's-
80%.
Okay.
So essentially it's this versus
Yeah.
that.
It gets 5 more people.
It's not
Yeah.
insignificant.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And that also correlates, that scenario 2 is anything that received a 90% score or higher gets 100% up.
It's 100%
Yeah,
of $8,000.
Yeah, and then 87 to 89.9 is 80.
I suppose I would tend more toward that, but that's just one voice of 9.
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I like scenario 2.
Is anyone opposed to using scenario 2 as the starting point?
Wait a second, we have alternative 1 and 2 and scenario.
Alternative 2 is scenario 2.
Okay, I got it. Scenario 1 is last year's.
Scenario 1 is funding as many as you can at 100% until you run out of money,
Got it. What,
Up to $80,000.
up to $80,000.
what are the totals now for 1, 2, and 3?
This leaves you $55. This one's over by 5,000, and this one leaves you
So
1,200.
we're close. In our next iteration, we go project by project, so we know if there's a refrigerator or if it's 75 individuals versus 100 individuals.
If the committee wants to go line by line, because Ray did say he didn't like the idea of going line by line. So that's something that you all have to decide as a group.
If not, you could settle on this and
Ray, I'm sorry, what did Ray say?
And Ray said that he, and Ray, you can speak up if I'm speaking, but he feels like when you get into that individual adjusting, that's when the biases and everything can come in. So Ray, do you want to speak any more to that, or?
Yes, and also that, we've put that into our scoring, right? We put that into whether the budget was relevant. So we have the objective measure of the whole group in scoring. And when we open it up to line by line, then oftentimes in this kind of thing, one voice, positive or negative, can make something happen that distorts the more objective thing that we've gotten to. If that were the case, then maybe, instead of scoring things, we should just kind of talk about them one by one. So I feel like it wounds the system from the work we've put in already.
And to just to remind you, I mean, we do have a very transparent process. This is going out online right now and everything. So we just need to be able to explain, if we do go line by line by line and we find one that's way down above somebody that's up, we have to be able to explain if that organization comes back and says, well, why were they funded, not weren't? We have to have a valid reason for that too.
I don't oppose discussion about different projects, funding 100 versus 80, because I think we can arrive at clarity sometimes with that. So I absolutely understand, Ray, your point, because we go through and we score it, and that's where we're at. But I also think discussion can bring some clarity that maybe we missed something, or maybe if we discount 1 to 80%, it makes it impossible for them to really get their work done, and we need to look at that. So I'm not opposed to talking things through as they come up. I don't know that we need to go line by line. I think that's pretty cumbersome. It's real hard. But if anybody has questions or comments or thoughts about the scenarios and the projects, I'm good with talking it out.
So, I'm sorry, real quick, before we move into that line by line stuff, do we have agreement on scenario or starting point?
On scenario 2, did we agree on that?
Yes.
And how many organizations were not?
23. And it does come in under budget.
Was anyone opposed to that?
So that's our starting point. And we have, is it 2 or 3 more meetings before we?
So we have one definite meeting 2 weeks from today. And then we have that next Tuesday, which would be 27th. So we have one scheduled for the 20th. And then we have the third meeting of the month, which could be the 27th. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
But the recommendations are due to the budget office by the 28th.
So we've got to make headway big time at the next meeting to arrive at our goal. Okay.
Will you email us this
Yes.
specific
Yes.
chart?
Question about whether we go to a third meter now. Do we have a hard stop at 2:30, or can we think that meeting may go longer?
More than
2
1
weeks from now.
Maybe a longer meeting then versus 2 meetings, if we can arrive at a consensus next time.
That's right. Don't say too much.
So Matt, are you over the need to extend that
What day is it?
the Thursday the 20th. So it looks like from a staff perspective and from a room perspective, we could extend it. So do we want to plan that? plan to schedule it till 3 that day.
Is that doable for everyone, or does anybody have a conflict?
I'm sorry, what day was that?
The 20th.
Ray's good, Ray's good. Okay.
Extend to 3.
Yes, 3.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left today, so just as a kind of recap, we're going to start with scenario 2. We'll email this out to you just so that you have time to look at that and see who is and isn't included in case you do have any information that you need. We're going to gather the information that Ray requested on the average per scoring category per focus area. And we'll make sure that we have that available for the next meeting. We'll meet on the 20th. We'll extend that a half hour in hopes of being able to not have to chop off a conversation midway or anything. Is there anything else that you all need to see getting ready for that next meeting or in that next meeting?
One of those 23, can we see what was funded, if anything, from last year?
Yes, we can add a column of the amount funded for last year.
And also, as I remember our last meeting, since it's Excel spreadsheet, we can rearrange the first column by alphabetical order if we need to.
Yes,
Okay.
very easily.
Is there anything related to other funding at the county level that would impact, like any funding changes that would impact the current organizations that are asking for funding, or that would be helpful to understanding? You see what I'm
Has
saying?
funding been discontinued
Yeah.
somewhere else?
Yeah.
With the county that has driven them to us?
So that is
Or
not
have
the
they been
case with
funded
any
through
of these
another
organizations.
process, or, you know?
That's not the case with any of these organizations, to my knowledge. We haven't been notified that any of them aren't eligible or anything, which we do have, because, I mean, it does happen from time to time. And we do communicate across departments, like funding has been suspended or whatever. And then also, we do look at the applications as they come in, just to make sure that, they're not funded in the recreation grant and also a strategic partnership grant, to make sure that, it is separate projects and everything, so none of that should affect these projects.
Thank you guys for everything. I know that's a lot of data and a lot of questions that you're answering on the fly.
Yeah.
With the help of Excel. So just appreciate you guys being able to pivot with all of our questions and getting us all these different scenarios.
And I know, the Build Back Better was there for $150,000. It reminds me, I compare it to when the YMI Culture Center asked for construction, funds for construction, and we sort of make recommendations of other areas where they can look instead of us funding for construction. I know it was asking for staff as well, but a lot of it was also asking for construction, if we can look at making those recommendations.
Right, and, like, in a case like that, and that's what we did with mine. We went back to them, like you said, and we said, okay, we can fund the programming aspect, but for capital, we don't have to, look at something elsewhere. And if you come across, if one of them is in the scenario and it's like that, where you say, well, we can't, we can't fund the refrigerator part, but we'll give you the seeds or whatever, that is something that is an option as well. We would just have to go back to the organization and work with them during contract development to include what is included in it.
One comment I want to make that I didn't notice in many of the applicants, that people, as part of their sustainability plan or as part of their grant application, didn't mention participation in the opportunities, which is a great way to fund human needs for underserved populations. And we have a lot of unspent money in that area, and Medicaid is about to expand. So it changes the healthcare environment and funding environment for some of these organizations. And so I hope people are paying attention to that because it's just, you know, some of the services that they're providing, they could get, some people could get it paid for by Medicaid. So I hope, I don't know, it seems like there might need to be some education there, just saying.
Yeah, and to that point, any of them that are funded, we do fall site visits and everything, or we do interact, you know, we can definitely bring that up during the site visits to them just to make sure that they are capitalizing on any opportunities that are out there and everything. But even, you know, even if they're not funded, if it's an application and you see something that, you know, we want to make sure that they're aware of, we can definitely pass along information to them.
The only other thing that I'll add, and I know that it was brought up earlier, that Fiscal Legal has 2 applications that rose to the top, and that would fall under scenario 2. And one of them is a homelessness prevention program. Another one of our community investment grant programs is through our planning department. That's the Affordable Housing Services Grant Program. And we try not to fund projects in one grant program like strategic partnerships that fit better in a different one. But unfortunately, there are 2 different departments running these grant programs. Our call for applications was at the same time, the same deadline. So Fiscal Legal did apply under strategic partnerships for this one. They didn't apply for the Affordable Housing Services program. So I just wanted to point that out as a consideration. It might be more appropriate in the Affordable Housing Grant Program, but just due to circumstances, I think it should be considered here.
I think that's real important to point out in our next iteration, our discussions. That is very pertinent information. So thank you.
And that is one of the areas that the county is working to improve is collaboration across the departments, because we have been very siloed in some of these programs. And then if something like this, you can't just move an application because it's a completely separate application. So we're even in works with trying to, obviously the whole application can't be uniform across the board, but at least having, parts of it where, the first half of the application is the same for any grant that you're applying for, and then there'll just be specific questions for each grant too, just to make it a little easier if we have to move on across, because that's one of the things now. Obviously, an affordable housing application is much more involved and asks a lot more details than we ask on strategic partnership. So just handing them that application, they would have any of the information they need anyway. So.
And that's something that we as staff can do a better job of too, is communicating that upfront to organizations, making sure they're aware of all the different grant programs that are available through the county and what that might look like, what might be the best fit for them.
It is published. Sort of grant page.
Yes.
Buckcounty.org.
Buckcounty.org /grants. And then even at the top, this is new this year, there's a PDF, I think that you can get to the PDF, which kind of gives you a brief overview of all of the different grant programs, and also that was one of the things we implemented this year to try to help organizations pinpoint which one they should go for. So. Does anyone have any other thoughts or questions or anything that you need to add to prepare for the next one? Jack?
How does the county, how do the commissioners decide what our total amount will be in terms of grants?
It's the amount that they appropriate during the budget process. And I mean, as a committee, you can recommend that we ask for more. It would have to be for the next, it would be for the 2025 cycle because the grant, the budget process is already works for this one. But we can request an increase, but then it's at the commissioner's discretion along with all of the other requests in the county. Because we did get a little bit of an increase last year. We went from 889 to 900,000. So
But then also, taking into account that, there are 8 different community investment grant programs in the county too, so they're all asking for increases too.
Well, if they're all asking for increases, we better make sure we.
Well, I can tell you 4 of them are not, because our department does 4 of them. Well, I guess early childhood. Early childhood is its own little thing, because when the commissioners passed the resolution for it, they did build an increase, a 2% increase each year into that one. So that one is an automatic increase, but the other ones are, if we request an increase in the budget, then it's considered as part of the overall budget process. And I can tell you that in the budget process, as you can imagine, with any company or any budget right now, they're asking for people to make reductions, not a lot of increases, so.
They were expressed, any questions about equality over by district. So,
Yes, so that is one thing that came about from the last time that we presented to them. They wanted to see, and so that's why this year we did add a new question to the application of the geographic location that was served, because before we were capturing the location of the organization, but we all know that the location of the organization is not necessarily where the work's happening. So that's why we added that, so that we could see that data and make sure that it is being dispersed, easily across the county.
So should we have that to?
can we add it to
What you share?
what this one by chance, just as far as, because I saw the addresses and we're just trying to figure out, just kind of equality across the county. Whether lots might be good just to know where they're from.
Yeah.
Because commissioners might be interested in seeing, oh, my district didn't get any, and,
And we have to answer to them.
Exactly, that's why I'm
We're
like,
like,
they're asking too much, like, that could be another one too, I have to go back to my constituents and be like, sorry, just because you live out here. But, yeah, okay, good, thank you.
And all of the addresses, I looked at the addresses as well, and they don't match the areas where they're served.
Yep.
Question, does the early childhood grant apply only to pre-K and younger?
I just wanted to end this with a bit of a snapshot about your starting point you selected. So of the focus areas, it's at the focus area level. These are the amounts that were requested, the number of applications that comprise those requests. This is the amount that you're starting at in terms of funding. And then these are the number of applications that would fund by focus area. And then just a percent of the request that you got overall that represents. So kind of a distillation of everything you talked about. This one?
No, the 20th, yeah.
Reservoir.
And that was a snapshot of scenario 2.
That's a snapshot of the scenario that you guys selected to start.
Is there anything helpful we could do, like as someone do in the next 2 weeks, looking, reviewing, can we get back in to look and kind of see and refresh some kind of blended, but I mean, to refresh on those specifics.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, especially, in the scenario, if you're concerned about any of them that are 80%, if you want to go back in between now and then and just kind of review their budget and everything and see, or review their project outline or anything and just make sure that it's not going to have an overall negative impact on their project or whatever. But like I said, we do it every year. Any of them that receive partial funding, we don't, if they come in and say they can serve 100 kids, we don't just automatically say, oh, well, they're getting 80%, so they can now serve 80 kids. We go back to the organizations and work with them to make sure, because, we work with them to get their new project plan, and then
some of them are staff people, and we can't hire a staff person.
And just be aware that if you do decide to make any moves in that, just keep this in the back of your head that you have $55 left. So if you intend to add anything anywhere, you'll be taking it from somewhere else.
Thank you all so much for all of your hard work and diligence and thoroughness. I know it's a lot of applications that we want here, and you all got them done wonderfully, so thank you.
So I ever considered doing like a resident well-being grants and like split them up into the 4 buckets so that there could be more applicants for environmental or one?
So that's something that, as a committee, you all can say, we're going, we wanna allocate of the 900,000, we're gonna allocate this many for resident well-being, we're gonna allocate so much. I mean, that's something that you can decide as a committee going forward. I mean, it's your process. You know,
See, I mean, like break down into four different applications, so authorize the well-being, then you can like equally grade those. Then you have your environmental or,
Yeah, so
whatever, you
if
know.
that's something that you all want to do going forward, after the year is over, I think it's June, we usually meet, we do a process review and a process improvement time. And at that point, we can entertain any of it. I will just, say if you are wanting to break it into separate applications or anything, committee members have to come up with the questions. And everything.
Well, I was just asking you, but you made never mind.
So do we have, like, for environment, do we have like a list of nonprofits that, just in terms of doing outreach?
So that is one area that the county tries to improve every year. Any nonprofit that has applied through any grant program for the county at any time is automatically notified when the application's open, as well as throughout the year. If we hear of them, like we've already got a notification list started for next year that we're throwing things on there. And then as well as we, reach out on social media, through press releases, through LinkedIn, everything. I mean, we try to cast the net as far as we can get it, but for some reason, we never get that many environmental applications.
Yeah.
I'm gonna change that.
Oh, well, I have an idea on what somebody else did. We could get somebody to do something in schools, so we can have workforce who understand that. Empty spaces.
So that's something that.
What a politically correct answer, you're really good at it. Even like, whatever you want to do. It's your committee, it's your committee.
I don't know. I'm not in that business, but I think it'd be a good idea. I think.
Thank you all. Thanks. Good to see
Okay,
you.
you're adjourned?
We have
Yes, I'm sorry. When Ray is waving his hand.
Say goodbye, everybody.
And we'll see you all